In the silence of his abandoned ranch, Jedediah Cooper buried his memories like seeds in dry earth. His rough hands, accustomed to solitude, no longer remembered the touch of those he had loved. His eyes, worn by time and tears never shed, looked at the horizon without hope. Until one night, amid thunder and lightning, the rain brought to his door two lost souls, a girl with eyes as green as forgotten meadows, and a boy with the face of familiar ghosts. In their gazes, he found the reflection of his own past and perhaps the promise of a future he believed withered. Like water that finds its way through the deepest cracks, love began to flow again in a heart that believed itself dry forever. If this story resonates in your soul, if you have ever felt that losses are cracks through which new light can filter, gift me your heart in the form of a like. And share with me, how do you think this story of rebirth will end? Because in each of your comments, a new chapter of our connection blooms. The sky of the Old West was crumbling in thunder. Clouds swollen with anger, black as coal, advanced over the dry plains of Texas. The tall grass swayed as if praying to the winds, uttering silent prayers that only the earth could understand. Lightning cut the firmament into luminous scars that disappeared as quickly as they came. In a lonely ranch, among dusty hills and fences twisted by time, Jedediah Cooper contemplated the horizon from his weathered porch. His eyes, the color of moist earth, had seen too many solitary dawns. The wrinkles on his face told stories his lips refused to pronounce. Each furrow, each line in his weather-beaten skin, was a chapter of losses that time had not managed to erase. The storm approached like an omen. Jed could feel it in his old bones, in that dull pain that reminded him of every winter and every decision that had led him to this life of self-imposed solitude. The wind changed direction, bringing the smell of wet earth that he so longed for. For years, drought had punished these lands without mercy. "Soon, Dusty," he murmured to his brown horse, who nervously whinnied in the nearby stable. "Tonight we'll sleep to the song of the rain." He retreated into his cabin, where shadows danced to the rhythm of the only kerosene lamp that illuminated the room. The wood creaked under his worn boots. The bare walls kept the echoes of conversations that had ceased years ago, a silence so familiar that it had become part of him, like his own breathing. When the rain began to furiously hit the roof, Jed closed his eyes. There was something in that sound that awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Images of a boy running through cornfields, a woman with a warm smile hanging clothes under the sun, a house burning in flames, while he shouted names that the wind carried away along with the ashes. The knocking on the door came like a shot in the middle of the night. 3 dry, desperate knocks. Jed instinctively took his rifle, years of caution converted into an automatic movement. Nobody visited the Cooper Ranch. Nobody had reason to do so. Upon opening the door, the wind pushed in a gust of rain, and a small girl who seemed to have been sculpted by the storm itself. Soaked to the bone, she trembled like a leaf. Her dress, too big for her fragile body, clung to her pale skin. She had dark brown hair stuck to her face, framing green eyes that shone with a mixture of terror and plea. The freckles on her nose looked like stars in a pale sky. "Sir," her voice was barely audible between the roar of the storm and the sobs that shook her body. "My friend. He fell from the bridge at Snake Creek. Please, you have to help." Jed felt something move inside him, like dry earth that finally receives water after years of drought. He said nothing. His words had dried up long ago, like the wells in the region. He looked at the kerosene lamp on the table, took his worn coat and hat, and with a silent gesture indicated the girl to follow him. Outside, the rain punished mercilessly. He mounted Dusty and extended a calloused hand toward the little one, who took it with the confidence that only the innocent or the desperate possess. He lifted her onto the horse's back, and together they entered the stormy night, where lightning illuminated the path like signals of a destiny that began to rewrite itself with each drop of rain that fell on the thirsty earth. The bridge at Snake Creek was little, more than a wooden skeleton that trembled under the fury of the current. Boards worn by time, now slippery from the rain, creaked as if begging for rest. Below, the murky water roared with ancestral hunger, swollen by the storm until it became a beast that devoured everything in its path. Jed dismounted with the agility he retained despite the years. The girl descended after him, her small body still trembling, but now her eyes reflected a fierce determination as she pointed toward a spot in the current. "There!" she shouted over the roar of the water. "He's holding on to something!" A lightning flash illuminated the scene like an instant photograph. A dark figure clung to what appeared to be a metal box trapped between rocks. The object momentarily gleamed under the electric light of the sky, revealing an unconscious boy who instinctively struggled to stay afloat. Without a word, Jed removed his coat and tied one end of a rope to a post that miraculously remained standing. The other end he secured around his waist with the experience of one who has lived tying livestock and tightening fences for decades. His fingers, thick and rough like the bark of ancient oaks, worked with a precision that contrasted with his rugged appearance. "Hold this," he told the girl, handing her his hat. "And don't go near the edge." They were the first words he had uttered since they left the ranch, and they sounded strange even to himself, as if his voice were a forgotten instrument that played again after years of silence. He slid down the muddy bank, feeling how the earth gave way beneath his weight, how the cold water hit him with fury, trying to drag him away. But Jed Cooper had survived worse storms, both those that came from the sky and those born within the soul. He advanced against the current, each step a battle between his will and the force of the water. When he reached the boy, he was barely moving. His fingers, white from the effort, still clung to the metal box, as if it contained something more valuable than his own life. Jed took him by the waist, noting how light he was, how fragile he seemed in his arms, weathered by the sun and work. It was then, as they struggled against the current to return to the shore, that the boy briefly opened his eyes. They were of such an intense blue that they seemed to absorb the scant light of the stormy night. His lips, pale and trembling, moved, forming words that were almost lost in the roar of the water. "Don't let them find," and he sank back into unconsciousness, his body limp against Jed's chest, who felt a strange tightness in the heart he had believed dead for years. With a final effort, they reached the shore. The girl ran toward them, her small feet splashing in the mud, her hands extended as if she wanted to embrace the whole world in her hug. Jed laid the boy on the wet earth, noticing for the first time the paleness of his face, the cut above his left eyebrow, the way his breathing, although weak, persisted stubbornly. "Is he?" The girl's voice broke before finishing the question. "Alive," Jed responded curtly, while checking the boy's pulse. "But we need to take him to a dry place." The girl nodded, her green eyes fixed on the metal box that the boy still held. For an instant, something passed through her gaze, a flash of recognition or fear. Jed couldn't interpret it, but when she looked up at him, there was only gratitude and hope. "My name is Clara," she said, as if suddenly feeling the need to introduce herself formally. "And he is, well, I call him Eli because it was the only thing he said when I found him." Jed nodded without asking more. Names had little value in a world where actions spoke with more clarity than any word. He carried the unconscious boy on his shoulders and helped Clara mount Dusty. Together they began the return to the ranch, where the kerosene lamp remained lit, like a solitary beacon amid the storm that now seemed to subside, as if it had fulfilled its purpose of bringing 3 lost souls under the same roof. The first rays of dawn filtered timidly through the cracks of the cabin when Jed finished treating the wound on Eli's forehead. His hands, accustomed to taming horses and repairing fences, moved with surprising delicacy as he applied an herbal ointment that his mother had taught him to prepare many years ago. The boy had not yet awakened, but his breathing had stabilized, and a slight color was beginning to return to his cheeks. Clara, sitting in a chair too big for her, observed each movement with the intensity of one who memorizes a sacred ritual. She had not left the boy's side all night, rejecting even the improvised bed that Jed had prepared for her. Her small hand held Eli's as if he might get lost in dreams if she let go. "You should rest," Jed murmured, surprising himself by breaking the silence. Clara shook her head, making strands of brown hair dance around her freckled face. "I can't leave him alone," she replied with a seriousness uncharacteristic of her years. "The last time I did, I almost lost him." There was a story in those words, a story that Jed wasn't sure he wanted to know. Stories brought memories, and memories were like the spines of the cacti that grew on the nearby hills, seemingly harmless until they pierced you to the core. "Where do you come from?" he finally asked, while storing his rudimentary medical implements in a worn wooden box. Clara looked toward the window where, The landscape transformed under the golden light of dawn. The raindrops, still clinging to the glass, refracted the light like tiny prisms. "From no specific place," she replied after a long silence, "and from all at once." It wasn't the answer Jed expected, but he understood what was behind those enigmatic words. He himself had been from no specific place since he lost his family. Rootedness was a luxury that some couldn't afford. The days began to pass in a strange dance of shared silences and routines that intertwined without anyone noticing. Jed would go out at dawn to tend to the skinny cattle he still kept, return for lunch that Clara prepared with the scarce supplies available, and spend the afternoons repairing what time and neglect had deteriorated at the ranch. Clara, for her part, assumed domestic tasks with an efficiency that spoke of a life where growing up too quickly had been a necessity, not a choice. She swept the wooden floors, hung clothes in the sun, and each afternoon read aloud by Eli's bed, old and worn books she had found in a forgotten chest. It was on the third day when Eli finally opened his eyes. There were no grand gestures or emotional words. Simply, while Clara was reading a passage about sailors and stars that guide the way home, the boy slightly turned his head and fixed his blue gaze on her, as if emerging from the depths of an inner ocean. "You kept reading," were his first words, barely a hoarse whisper after days of silence. Clara dropped the book and took his hand with more strength. "I promised you we would finish the story," she replied with a smile that illuminated the room more than the sun entering through the window. Jed, who observed from the doorway, felt a tightness in his chest. There was something in the way these two children communicated, in the small gestures, in the unspoken words, that reminded him of a language he thought forgotten. The language of those who have shared too much in too little time, of those who understand that sometimes words are insufficient to express what the soul needs to say. That night, while the children slept, Jed went out to the porch and contemplated the stars. The drought had returned after the storm, and the dry air scratched his throat. He should have sent them to the town of Dry Gulch, handed them over to the sheriff or the doctor, but something in him resisted the idea of seeing them leave. Perhaps it was selfishness, he thought, or perhaps it was that, for the first time in years, the silence of his ranch was no longer a constant reminder of all he had lost, but a space where something new, fragile and still unnamed, began to grow, like those desert flowers that wait years to bloom after a single rain. The metal box remained on the mantelpiece intact, like a mechanical heart that kept secrets in its iron entrails. No one had mentioned it since that night at the creek. It was as if there existed a tacit agreement to keep it in sight but out of conversation, a silent witness to something they were not yet prepared to face. Eli recovered slowly. His young body healed, but his mind seemed to inhabit a labyrinth of fog. He didn't remember his last name, or where he came from, or who his parents were. Memories appeared fragmented, like pieces of a broken mirror that reflected partial images without coherence between them. "Sometimes I see fire," he confessed to Clara one afternoon while they both fed the chickens in the pen. "And I hear voices shouting words I don't understand, but when I try to approach those memories, they disappear like smoke." Clara nodded, scattering dry corn with circular movements of her small hand. "My grandmother used to say that memory is like a frightened cat," she replied with the borrowed wisdom of the elderly. "If you try to catch it, it runs away. You have to let it come to you." Jed, who observed them from a distance while repairing a fence, felt a pang of admiration for that girl who seemed to carry within her the soul of someone much older. He had noticed how Eli constantly sought his approval, how his eyes followed him when he thought no one was looking. It was the gaze of one seeking an anchor amid the storm. That night, while the children slept, Jed found himself in front of the metal box. The light from the kerosene lamp projected his shadow on the wall, elongated and distorted as if it belonged to another person. His fingers caressed the cold surface, feeling each dent, each mark that told the story of an object that had traveled far and survived much. The decision was almost involuntary. His hands acted on their own, lifting the lid with a metallic squeak that seemed to resonate in the silence of the night like a scream. Inside, wrapped in a piece of discolored cloth, he found a medallion. It was of ancient silver, crafted with the delicacy of an artisan who imprints his soul in every detail. In the center, engraved with precision, a star split in half shone under. The trembling light. Jed felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that symbol. He had seen it hanging from his mother's neck until the day of her death. He had seen it carved in the rocks of the canyon to the north, where she used to take him when he was a child. "Real water sleeping under the earth," she would tell him while caressing the split star. "Our legacy, Jedediah. Someday you will understand." Next to the medallion, a piece of yellowed paper showed a phrase written in an elegant calligraphy that contrasted with the roughness of the paper. "The spring is where the shadow of the rock kisses the earth." "It's the only thing he has." Clara's voice startled him. The girl was standing in the doorway, barefoot, with her white nightgown that made her look like a small ghost. "He never separates from that box. When I found him, he was hugging it as if it were the only real thing in the world." Jed didn't ask how or where she had found him. Some stories need time to be told, and he, more than anyone, understood the value of silence. "Do you know what it means?" he asked instead, showing her the medallion. Clara approached, her steps silent on the wood of the floor. She took the medallion in her small hands, examining it as if it were a text in a language she was trying to decipher. "Eli draws this symbol every night before sleeping," she said finally. "He does it in the earth, on the fogged window, even in the air with his fingers, as if trying to remember something." "Through it?" Jed nodded slowly. He put the medallion back in the box but kept the note in his shirt pocket. There was something in that coincidence that awakened in him a forgotten restlessness, as if the gears of a clock that had stopped working began to move again. "You should go back to bed," he told Clara, closing the box carefully. "Tomorrow there's much to do." The girl looked at him with that intensity that seemed to pierce the defenses he had built during years of solitude. "Are you going to help us, Mr. Cooper?" she asked, and in her voice there was both the innocence of a child and the determination of someone who has learned too early that life rarely offers second chances. Jed didn't respond immediately. The words stuck in his throat like the dry sand of the desert. Finally, he placed a hand on Clara's thin shoulder, a gesture that for him was equivalent to an oath. "I'm already helping you, aren't I?" he murmured, with a roughness that tried to hide the emotion he felt. "Now to bed." As Clara walked away down the hall, Jed looked again at the metal box. The lamplight danced on its surface, creating reflections that seemed to tell stories without words. Stories of loss and finding, of buried secrets and truths to discover. Stories that somehow seemed to intertwine with his own, like threads of different colors that form the same fabric. Outside, the wind blew over the dry lands, carrying with it the whisper of ancient promises and new beginnings. The morning arrived with a scorching heat that seemed to want to consume the last drop of moisture that the storm had left. Jed found himself in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, contemplating the face that stared back at him. Deep lines furrowed his forehead and the corners of his eyes, maps of a life marked by the relentless sun and losses he had never managed to fully name. He ran his hand through his graying beard, feeling under his fingers the rough texture that was like the very earth of his ranch. The medallion with the split star rested on his chest, hanging from a leather cord he had found among his belongings. He didn't know why he had decided to wear it, but he felt that, somehow, it was the right thing to do. Memories came in waves that morning, unearthed by the presence of that familiar symbol. His mother, Eleonora Cooper, with her hands always busy and her voice that seemed to contain the wisdom of generations. His father, Amos, a man of few words but firm gestures, who had taught him that the land must be respected because it holds the secrets of those who inhabit it. And then there were the memories that hurt like fresh wounds. Sarah, his wife, with her laughter that could illuminate the darkest night. Michael, his son, barely a child when fire took everything. And among the ashes of that previous life, a ghost he had never managed to fully bury, his younger brother Thomas, who disappeared years ago after an argument that ended with words that should never have been spoken. A noise brought him back to the present. Through the bathroom window, he saw Clara and Eli in the corral. The girl was trying to teach the boy how to approach Dusty without frightening him. Her gestures were patient, her explanations accompanied by careful demonstrations. Eli watched her attentively, imitating each movement with absolute concentration. It was strange how these two children had begun to fit into the empty spaces of his life, like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he was trying to complete. The way Clara hummed while sweeping the porch in the mornings, the way Eli sat beside him when he repaired tools, passing him what he needed before he asked for it, as if he could read his thoughts. Jed went out to the backyard, where the water pump squeaked in protest from the effort of extracting the increasingly scarce liquid. The drought was worsening. Nearby wells were drying up one after another, and neighboring ranchers were beginning to sell their livestock at miserable prices rather than watch it die of thirst. Soon he would have to make difficult decisions. As he filled a bucket with murky water, he noticed a yellowish envelope nailed to the post by the entrance. Mail rarely reached his isolated ranch. He approached, wiping his hands on his pants, and tore off the envelope. The elegant letterhead contrasted with the simplicity of his surroundings. Black River Oil Company. Inside, a letter written with the precision of office machines and the coldness of those who see the land only as a resource to exploit. They offered him a considerable sum for his ranch, much more than it was worth in its current state, especially considering the drought. The offer was generous, too generous, enough to start over somewhere else, perhaps in a city where the past wouldn't haunt him at every step. Jed crumpled the letter in his fist. There was something that didn't add up. Why so much interest in dry lands, in a ranch that barely produced enough to maintain a solitary man? Bad news? Eli appeared at his side, silent as only children can be. His blue eyes, now more vivid since he had begun to recover, fixed on the crumpled paper. "Nothing important," Jed replied, storing the letter in his shirt pocket, next to the note from the medallion. "How's the lesson with Dusty going?" Eli smiled, a gesture that completely transformed his face, illuminating it with a joy that seemed too pure for this dusty world. "Clara says I have good hands," he replied with pride. "That animals can feel when someone doesn't want to harm them." Jed nodded, allowing himself a slight smile. It was true. The boy had a gift with animals. He had seen him calm an agitated hen by just holding it in his hands and murmuring words that no one else could hear. "My father used to say the same thing," he commented, surprising himself by sharing that fragment of his past. "That there are people who are born speaking the language of silent creatures." Eli looked at him with renewed interest, as if each word about Jed's past were a valuable piece that he collected eagerly. "Did your father teach you everything about the ranch?" he asked, with that genuine curiosity that only children possess. Jed nodded slowly as they resumed the path toward the corral where Clara awaited them. "He and this land," he replied, encompassing with a gesture the landscape that surrounded them. "The land has its own way of teaching, if one learns to listen to it." Eli seemed to reflect on those words, as if they contained a truth that resonated in some forgotten corner of his memory. "Sometimes," he said finally, in a low voice as if sharing a secret, "when I touch the earth, I feel as if it wanted to tell me something, as if I already knew it but had forgotten the language." Jed felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the relentless heat of the morning. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that was becoming natural between them. A bridge between silence and the words they were not yet ready to pronounce. Together they continued walking, their shadows casting long on the thirsty earth, while the medallion of the split star seemed to beat against Jed's chest, like a second heart awakening after a long sleep. July advanced mercilessly over the lands of Texas. The heat crawled like a living beast, devouring the scant moisture that remained, cracking the earth in patterns that looked like ancient scars on dry skin. The drought, which had already lasted longer than any inhabitant of the region remembered, intensified day by day, turning streams into dusty beds and pastures into brittle straw. Jed observed how his skinny cattle sought shade under the few trees that still retained some leaves. Soon he would have to make a decision: sell the animals at sacrifice prices, or watch them die of thirst and hunger. Neither option pleased him, but the reality of the West was merciless with those who clung to sentimentality. "Mr. Cooper," Clara's voice drew him from his musings. The girl held an empty bucket and looked at him with concern. "The pump isn't drawing water anymore, just a brown trickle and then nothing." Jed nodded, not really surprised. It was a matter of time. The signs had been there for weeks. The increasingly lower level, the increasingly earthier taste, the growing effort to extract each drop. "We'll have to go to the communal well in Dry Gulch," he replied, mentally calculating how much water they would need to survive the next few days. "Prepare some empty barrels. We'll leave at sunset when the heat subsides." Clara didn't move. Her green eyes, which seemed to absorb the sunlight and transform it into something deeper, remained fixed on him. "The people in town are talking," she said finally. "Eli and I heard them when we went to get eggs at the Peterson farm. They say there's a company that's buying all the land, that they have machines that can find water where no one else can. Chabeti felt a familiar tension at the base of his neck, so the rumors were already circulating. In places like Dry Gulch, secrets had short legs. People talk a lot when they have dry mouths, he replied, with more harshness than he intended. Go prepare those barrels. Clara obeyed this time, but not without first giving him a look that contained a wisdom inappropriate for her years, as if she perfectly understood what Jed was not saying. As he watched her walk away, Jed took out the crumpled black river oil letter from his pocket. He had read it so many times that he could recite it from memory. The offer was generous, yes, but there was something about it that aroused his distrust, like the sudden silence of coyotes before a storm. At sunset, with the sun tinting the horizon blood red, Jed prepared the old cart pulled by Dusty. Clara and Eli loaded the empty barrels, working in that coordinated silence they had developed, as if they could communicate without the need for words. "I've never been to town," Eli commented while securing the last barrel. "At least not that I remember." There was something in his voice, a mixture of excitement and fear, that made Jed look at him more carefully. The boy had changed in the weeks he had been at the ranch. His cheeks, once hollow, now showed a healthy bronzed color. His movements were more confident, his gaze clearer. But the shadow of the unknown, of that lost memory, still lurked behind his eyes. "It's not much," Jed replied, adjusting the reins. "A handful of dusty buildings and people doing what they can to survive." Clara, who had already climbed onto the cart, extended a hand to help Eli. "There's a store with candies of all colors," she said, with an enthusiasm that betrayed her attempt to appear indifferent. "And a pianist in the cantina, who plays songs that make even the toughest cowboys cry." Jed couldn't help a slight smile. It was surprising how these children, despite everything they had been through, retained that ability to marvel, to find joy in the smallest details. The journey to Dry Gulch passed in a comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Clara's observations about the stars that began to appear in the sky, or Eli's questions about the names of plants that survived at the edge of the road. As they approached the town, Jed felt his body tense. It had been months since he had visited Dry Gulch, preferring the solitude of his ranch to the curious looks and unasked questions of the inhabitants. Everyone knew his story, or at least the version that rumors had built over the years. The man who lost his family in a fire. The man who locked himself in his pain, as one who locks oneself in a cell and throws away the key. "Stay close to me," he instructed the children as they entered the main street, "and don't talk to strangers." The town seemed even more desolate than he remembered. Many businesses were closed, their windows boarded up like blind eyes. The drought had hit everyone equally, taking first the hopes and then the livelihoods. They headed directly to the communal well, where a small line of people waited their turn with buckets and canteens. Jed noticed the looks that settled on them, the surprise at seeing him accompanied by two children, the whispers that began like ripples in a pond. While they waited, Eli stayed unusually close to Jed, almost hiding behind his imposing figure. Clara, on the other hand, observed everything with avid eyes, absorbing details, memorizing faces. It was then that Jed saw it, a poster newly placed on the wall of the town hall. "Great Corn Festival," it announced in large and colorful letters, promising music, food, and fun. "Sponsored by Black River Oil Company," it read in smaller letters at the bottom. "Mr. Cooper," a deep voice drew him from his thoughts. "What a surprise to see you in town." Sheriff Donovan approached, his star shining on his chest like a watchful eye. He was a burly man, with a thick mustache that hid his mouth and small eyes that revealed nothing. "Donovan," Jed greeted curtly. "We just came for water." The sheriff nodded, but his gaze shifted toward the children with evident curiosity. "I didn't know you had company at the ranch," he commented, with a tone that pretended to be casual but contained a clear question. "They're my cousin's children from Austin," Jed lied without hesitation. "They're spending the summer with me while she recovers from an illness." Clara and Eli maintained a perfect silence, though Jed could feel the tension in the boy's body, which had gone rigid as a board. The sheriff seemed to accept the explanation, or at least decided not to question it for the moment. "You should bring them to the festival," he said, pointing to the poster. "It'll be next Saturday. Everyone's invited. Black River Oil is trying to win the town's favor. They've even brought a new doctor, Dr. Remington, A guy from the East Coast with modern ideas. He's attending to anyone who needs it for free. Jed nodded out of courtesy, but he was already calculating how long it would take to fill the barrels and return to the ranch. "I'll think about it," he replied, knowing he wouldn't. When it finally came their turn in line, Jed noticed that the water coming from the communal well was almost as murky as that from his own pump. The drought did not discriminate, and soon not even this resource would be available. On the way back to the ranch, under a starry sky that seemed to mock the thirst of the earth, Jed felt the weight of the medallion against his chest. The words written in that note resonated in his mind. "The spring is where the shadow of the rock kisses the earth." Perhaps, he thought, as he watched the children doze in the back of the cart, it was time to seek answers in the past he had tried so hard to forget. At night, when silence thickened like dark honey and shadows danced to the rhythm of the kerosene lamp, Eli drew. His thin fingers held the piece of charcoal with a precision that contrasted with the apparent fragility of his body. On pieces of yellowed paper, smooth pieces of wood, or even in the earth of the yard, the symbol appeared again and again. The split star, each time more detailed, each time more precise. Jed observed him from a distance, pretending to be busy repairing old harnesses or cleaning tools that didn't need it. There was something hypnotic about the way the boy traced the lines, as if each movement were part of a ritual to invoke lost memories. "It's as if his hands remember what his mind has forgotten," Clara commented one night, sitting next to Jed on the porch. The girl had that habit of appearing silently, as if she were part of the shadows that inhabited the house. Jed nodded, without taking his eyes off Eli, who was drawing on the kitchen table, visible through the open window. "My mother used to say that the body keeps its own memories," he replied, the words emerging from a place so deep within him that he almost didn't recognize them as his own. "That sometimes the hands know what the mind tries to protect us from remembering." Clara looked at him with that intensity that made Jed wonder if she really was just a girl and not an ancient soul trapped in a small body. "Do you think it's dangerous?" she asked finally. "What he's trying to remember?" The question hung in the night air, loaded with implications that neither of them was prepared to fully explore. "I think secrets have their own time to reveal themselves," Jed replied after a long silence, "like seeds that wait under dry earth until the right rain comes." Clara seemed satisfied with that answer. She rose with the silent grace that characterized her and headed toward the kitchen, where Eli now contemplated his most recent work with his brow furrowed in concentration. Jed remained on the porch, watching as the stars emerged one by one in the sky, black as velvet. The medallion weighed against his chest, constant reminder of unanswered questions. The routine continued for days. Water became increasingly scarce, forcing them to ration every drop. Jed's cattle, reduced to a handful of skeletal cows, barely had the strength to move into the shade. And yet, amid this desolation, something flourished at the Cooper Ranch, a strange sense of belonging, of shared purpose. It was on a particularly hot morning when Eli appeared in the stable where Jed was repairing a saddle. The boy held a drawing more elaborate than the previous ones. It wasn't just the split star this time, but a rudimentary map where the symbol appeared superimposed on what seemed to be a rock formation. "I dreamed it last night," he explained, extending the paper toward Jed with slightly trembling hands. "This place, I feel like I've been there before." Jed took the drawing, feeling his heart accelerate. The sketch, though childish, clearly showed the canyon north of his property, where his mother used to take him. The same rock formations, the same pattern of stones that seemed placed by giant hands in forgotten times. "I know this place," he said finally, with a voice that sounded strange even to his own ears. "It's about 2 hours on horseback from here." Eli's eyes lit up with a hope so pure it almost hurt to look at it directly. "Can we go?" he asked. And in that simple question was a whole universe of yearning and fear, of desire to know and fear of what he might discover. Jed hesitated. That place was loaded with his own memories, with lessons whispered by his mother about family traditions that dated back to times when the first Coopers arrived in these lands. Taking Eli there meant opening doors he had kept closed for years. "We'll have to prepare well," he finally replied. "There's no water on the way, and the August sun doesn't forgive the careless." Eli's smile was like a miniature sunrise. illuminating his face in a way that made something stir in Jed's chest, something he believed dead, and buried along with his family. That night, as they prepared what was necessary for the journey, Clara was unusually silent. She packed provisions with mechanical movements, her face a mask that hid her thoughts. "What's wrong?" Jed asked when they were finally alone in the kitchen, Eli already asleep in the adjoining room. Clara raised her gaze, and for the first time since he had known her, Jed saw fear in her green eyes. "There are people looking for him," she said softly, as if afraid that the walls might hear. "Men with expensive suits and black hats. I saw them in town when we went for water. They were asking about a lost boy." Jed felt a familiar tension run down his back, that protective instinct he believed forgotten. "Did they see you?" he asked, his voice a harsh whisper. Clara shook her head. "I hid behind the trough, but I heard they were offering money to anyone who gave them information." Jed nodded slowly, processing this new information. The pieces were beginning to fit, though the complete picture remained blurry. The company interested in apparently worthless lands, the boy with amnesia who obsessively drew an ancient symbol, the medallion with the enigmatic phrase about a hidden spring. "Tomorrow we'll go to the canyon," he decided, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "The three of us. It's time to find answers." Clara nodded, and in her gesture was a determination that matched Jed's. They were, after all, survivors, people who had learned to live on the margins to find strength in the spaces between unspoken words. That night, while Clara and Eli slept, Jed went up to the dusty attic he hadn't visited in years. Among forgotten boxes and memories covered in cobwebs, he was looking for something he knew was there, patiently waiting. His mother's trunk with its secrets and its stories, with the answers that perhaps had always been within his reach, if only he had had the courage to seek them. Dawn found them already on their way, three solitary silhouettes against the horizon that began to tinge with gold and crimson. Jed rode Dusty, with Eli seated in front of him. Clara rode a gentle mare they had borrowed from neighbor Peterson, an older man who didn't ask questions and silently thanked the occasional help that Jed provided with fences and cattle. The desert stretched before them like a motionless ocean, occasionally dotted with twisted shrubs and cacti that survived where nothing else could. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of hooves on the dry earth and the occasional caw of a crow that watched them pass. Eli kept the drawing extended over the pommel of the saddle, constantly comparing the rock formations that appeared in the distance with those he had traced on the paper. His eyes shone with a mixture of anticipation and fear, as if each step brought them not only to a physical place, but to a truth that could change everything. Clara rode slightly ahead, her small figure erect with a dignity that contrasted with her age. Now and then she turned her head to make sure they were following, her brown hair dancing with the dry desert wind. No one spoke. Words seemed superfluous on this journey, where each carried their own hopes and fears like invisible provisions. After almost 3 hours of travel, the landscape began to change. The plain gave way to increasingly prominent rock formations, until finally they found themselves in front of the entrance to a narrow canyon, flanked by walls of reddish rock that rose toward the sky like silent guardians. "It's here," murmured Eli, his voice barely audible but loaded with a certainty that made Jed look at him with renewed curiosity. They dismounted and tied the horses in the scant shade of a twisted mesquite. Jed checked that the canteens were secured and took a small shovel he had brought, inspired by the note found in the metal box. "The spring is where the shadow of the rock kisses the earth. Let's stay together," he instructed the children as they entered the canyon. "These places can be treacherous." The echo of their steps accompanied them like an invisible fourth traveler. As they advanced, the walls of the canyon seemed to narrow and then expand in a rhythm that recalled the breathing of a living being. Small niches in the rock showed ancient paintings, hands, animals, symbols that spoke of times when other inhabitants had found refuge in these same walls. Eli walked as if in a trance, his eyes fixed on the rocks, looking for something that only he seemed capable of recognizing. Clara stayed close to Jed, her hand occasionally brushing his, a fleeting but comforting contact amid the mineral immensity that surrounded them. It was near noon, when the sun fell directly on the canyon, eliminating almost all shadows, when Eli stopped abruptly. "There!" he exclaimed, pointing toward a rock formation that rose a few meters away. Jed followed the direction of his finger and saw it, carved in the reddish stone, worn by centuries of wind and sand but still recognizable, the symbol of the split star. It was exactly the same as the one on the medallion he wore around his neck, as the obsessive drawings of Eli, as the one his mother had shown him so many years ago. They approached in silence, as if they feared that a noise might make disappear that tangible link with the past. Eli extended a trembling hand and touched the symbol, his fingers following the lines carved in the stone with the reverence of one who recognizes something sacred. "I remember it," he whispered, his voice broken by emotion. "Someone brought me here before, someone who held me in their arms and showed me this symbol while talking to me about water and stars." Clara approached him and took his hand, a silent gesture of support that said more than any word of consolation. Jed observed the scene with a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he were reliving a moment he had already experienced from another perspective. His mother, Eleonora, had brought him to this same place when he was little more than Eli's age. She had told him stories about the first Coopers, about how they had found water where others only saw stone and desperation. "Water always finds its way through the hardest rock," she had said, her words now as clear in Jed's memory as if she had spoken them yesterday. "And our family will always find its way back to this place." With a decisive movement, Jed approached the base of the rock where the symbol was carved. The sun had begun its descent, and now an elongated shadow projected from the rock formation, pointing to a specific spot on the canyon floor. Without a word, he began to dig at that exact point. The earth was hard, compacted by years of drought, but Jed worked with the determination of one who has finally found a purpose. Clara and Eli soon joined, using their hands to remove the earth that Jed's shovel displaced. They dug in silence, the only sound the scraping of metal against stone and earth, the increasingly accelerated breathing of the three, the occasional caw of a scavenger bird that observed them from the top of the canyon. It was Eli who first noticed the change. His hands, sunk in the earth, felt the moisture. "Here," he said simply, his voice barely an astonished whisper. Jed intensified his efforts, digging now with renewed energy. The earth became darker, moister with each shovelful, and then, like a miracle they had invoked with their combined faith and effort, the water emerged. First a timid thread, barely visible, and then a crystalline jet that shone under the setting sun, reflecting golden and reddish flashes as if it contained fragments of the sky itself. The three stepped back, astonished at the spectacle of life that sprung up in the middle of the desert. The water now flowed strongly, forming a small stream that began to spread across the canyon floor, seeking its way among the stones, returning to them the reflection of their amazed faces. Eli was the first to approach again. He knelt beside the newly discovered spring and plunged his hands into the crystalline water. A sob escaped his throat, a sound that seemed to come from a place so deep within him that it surprised even Clara, who knew him better than anyone. "I was here before," he said through tears, "with someone who loved me, someone who told me this place was our secret, our treasure." Jed approached and knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder with a gentleness that contrasted with his rugged appearance. "My mother brought me here when I was a child," he confessed, the words now emerging more easily, as if the water that sprouted from the earth had also loosened the knot that kept his memories captive. "She told me that the Coopers had always known where to find water, even in the driest times, that it was our gift and our responsibility." Clara, who had remained slightly apart, now approached. Her eyes reflected the water and the sky, fused in a liquid mirror that seemed to contain all the answers they sought. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice a reverent whisper. "Why does Eli know this place? Why does he draw that symbol?" Jed didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years he felt he was on the right path to finding them. He looked at the medallion hanging from his neck, then at Eli, and finally at the water that continued to flow, unstoppable, as if it had waited all this time to be released. "I think it's time to return to the ranch," he finally said. "There's a trunk in the attic that has been closed for too long." As they filled their canteens with fresh water from the spring, Jed felt that something within him also flowed freely for the first time in too long. Hope. A fragile hope, still without defined form, but as real as the water that now moistened the dry earth of the canyon, promising life where before there was only desolation. The afternoon light filtered through the cracks of the attic, creating golden beams that danced with the dust suspended in the air. The space, low and narrow, smelled of old wood and stopped time. Jed moved carefully among boxes and objects covered with yellowed sheets, vestiges of a previous life he had tried unsuccessfully to forget. Clara and Eli followed him in silence, their steps cautious, as if they understood they were entering a sanctuary of memories where each object had a weight and a history that deserved respect. "My mother kept everything up here," Jed explained, his voice unusually soft in the dimness of the attic. "She said that important things should be kept elevated, closer to the sky than to the earth." At the back, under the lowest eave of the roof, rested a dark wooden chest with metal ornaments that, despite time, retained an almost supernatural shine. The symbol of the split star was carved on the lid, along with initials that time had made almost illegible, EC. Jed knelt in front of the chest, feeling the weight of the children's eyes on him. His hands, rough and weathered by years of work under the relentless sun, now seemed strangely delicate as they caressed the wood of the chest, as if re-establishing a long-interrupted contact with something precious. From the pocket of his shirt, he extracted a small bronze key that hung from the same cord as the medallion. He inserted it into the lock, and the mechanism yielded with a click that resonated in the expectant silence. Upon opening the lid, an aroma of dry lavender and ancient paper emerged like the sigh of a ghost. Inside, carefully arranged, were yellowed documents, faded photographs, small objects wrapped in cotton cloth, letters tied with ribbons of colors faded by time. Jed first extracted a bundle of documents, property deeds, birth records, notarial letters. He examined them carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. "They're the original land titles," he murmured, more to himself than to the children. "My mother kept them here. They include not just the ranch, but all the territory up to the canyon, including the spring." Clara approached, her avid eyes scanning the documents, although she couldn't fully understand their legal meaning. "Does that mean the water belongs to you?" she asked with that direct clarity that characterized her. "To the Coopers?" Jed nodded slowly, while continuing to extract objects from the chest. He found an old photo album, bound in dark leather, and with the same star symbol engraved on the cover. He opened it with reverence. The pages creaked as they turned, revealing faces of people who shared certain features. The firm gaze, the defined line of the jaw, something indefinable in the way they held their shoulders. Generations of Coopers looked from the paper, silent witnesses to a family history that extended like the roots of an ancient tree. Jed stopped at a particular photograph. It showed two young men in front of the ranch porch with a baby in the arms of the younger one. The date at the bottom indicated it had been taken a little over 10 years ago. "My brother Thomas," said Jed, pointing to the younger man. "And me." The resemblance was undeniable, although Thomas seemed thinner, with softer features and a smile that contrasted with Jed's serious expression. Eli had approached and was now looking at the photograph with an intensity that made Jed observe him more carefully. The boy extended a trembling hand and touched the image of the baby with an almost reverent gesture. "I know him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That place, that porch." Jed felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear that almost prevented him from breathing. He continued searching in the chest until he found what he had unconsciously been looking for from the beginning, a thick envelope with Thomas's name, written in Eleonora Cooper's elegant calligraphy. He opened it carefully, as if fearing that its contents might vanish upon contact with the air. Inside were letters, many of them unopened, and an official document that made Jed pale as he read it. "What is it?" asked Clara, moving closer, feeling the tension emanating from Jed like an electric field. "It's the birth certificate of Elijah Cooper," Jed replied, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "Son of Thomas and Margaret Cooper, my nephew." Eli had remained completely still, his blue eyes fixed on the document, as if trying to absorb its meaning through his gaze. "Elijah," he finally repeated, the word sounding strange and familiar at the same time on his lips. "Is that my name?" Jed nodded slowly, while extracting more documents from the envelope. Yellowed newspaper clippings related the tragedy. A fire at Thomas Cooper's house on the outskirts of Dry Gulch. Thomas's body identified among the remains, his wife Margaret, deceased from smoke inhalation. The body of their son Elijah, never found, presumably reduced to ashes in the fire that had consumed everything. The same fire that weeks later had also taken Jed's wife and son on a night of strong wind and sparks that flew from the barn to the main house. The fire that had left him alone, bitter, locked in his pain like an oyster around a grain of sand. "But you survived," Jed murmured, looking at Eli with new eyes, now clearly seeing Thomas's features in his face, the way he tilted his head, the exact color of his eyes. "Somehow, you survived." Clara, who had remained silent while the revelation unfolded, now approached Eli and took his hand firmly. "I found you in the woods near the creek," she said, her voice firm despite the emotion that shone in her eyes. "You were hurt and scared. You didn't remember anything except your name, Eli, and you had that metal box pressed against your chest as if it were the most valuable thing in the world." Eli nodded slowly, fragments of memory beginning to fit together like pieces of a puzzle long dispersed. "Someone took me out of the fire," he murmured, his gaze lost in images that only he could see. "A woman. She told me to run toward the creek, not to look back. She gave me the box and told me to protect it, that it contained the truth about the water and about my family." Jed continued searching in the chest, as if the answer to this new mystery might be hidden among the objects his mother had kept with such care. He found a leather-bound diary with Eleonora Cooper's neat and tight handwriting. He opened it, and his eyes stopped at an entry dated just a few weeks before the fire. "Thomas has discovered something that could change everything. He says that Black River Oil knows about the spring, that they have been buying lands around our properties. He's scared, but determined. Water is worth more than oil in times of drought, he told me today, and our duty is to protect it, so that it remains for everyone, and not just for those who can pay for it." Jed closed the diary, feeling how the pieces began to fit. Black River Oil's insistence on buying his seemingly worthless ranch, the presence of men looking for a lost boy, the fire that had ended the lives of Thomas and his wife, but not that of their son, who had somehow survived, carrying with him the secret of the spring. "It wasn't an accident," he murmured, the realization hitting him with the force of a mace. Neither of the two fires was. Clara, with that perception that seemed to go beyond her years, nodded gravely. "That's why the men in town are looking for him," she said, squeezing Eli's hand more tightly, "because they know he is the proof that the lands and the water belong to the Coopers, not to them." Jed looked at the two children, so small and fragile in the face of the magnitude of what they were discovering, and yet so strong in their determination. He felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a clear purpose, a reason to go on that went beyond mere day-to-day survival. "We have to protect the spring," he finally said, his voice acquiring a renewed firmness, "and for that we need everyone to know the truth." As they carefully put the documents and objects back in the chest, a noise on the ground floor startled them, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening, followed by footsteps trying to be stealthy, but which the old wood of the floor betrayed with revealing creaks. The three looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Jed took the most important documents and stored them in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to the medallion. Then, with a gesture, he indicated to the children to remain silent while he headed toward the attic stairs, prepared to face whoever had decided to interrupt this moment of revelations. Jed descended the attic stairs with the caution of a predator, each step calculated to avoid the creak of the old wood. He had left the children upstairs with precise instructions: remain silent, and if they heard anything suspicious, exit. Through the small roof window that led to the back shed, the house was shrouded in an unsettling dimness, the shadows of evening stretching like dark fingers across the worn furniture. Jed could feel the presence of someone in the main room, an alteration in the air that his senses, sharpened by years of solitude, instinctively captured. As he turned the corner of the hallway, his hand already near the gun he carried at his belt, he came face to face with a figure he did not expect. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor's wife, an older woman with a kind face furrowed by wrinkles that spoke of a life under the relentless Texas sun. "Jedediah Cooper," she said, and there was something in her voice, a mixture of reproach and urgency, that made Jed stop his hand halfway to the gun. "Excuse me for entering like this, but I knocked and no one answered. The door was open." Jed nodded, without completely relaxing his posture. Recent times had taught him to distrust even familiar faces. "What brings you here, Mrs. Peterson?" he asked, keeping himself between her and the stairs that led to the attic. The woman held a package wrapped in cotton cloth in her hands, which she pressed against her chest as if fearing someone might snatch it from her. "That girl," she said finally, her clear eyes fixed on Jed with an intensity that took him by surprise. "The one you've been sheltering. Clara." The name pronounced by that woman produced an immediate effect. A creak on the stairs revealed that Clara had disobeyed the order to stay upstairs and was now peering out, her green eyes enormous in her pale face. "Mrs. Peterson," murmured the girl, and there was recognition in her voice, though not the familiarity that Jed would have expected if they really knew each other. The old woman extended the package toward Clara with slightly trembling hands. "Your grandmother asked me to give it to you if I ever saw you," she explained, and her voice softened when addressing the girl. "Eleonora and I were friends, you know, since we were young, long before this place became so dry and sad." Clara descended the stairs completely and took the package with a reverence that suggested she understood the importance of the moment. Jed, meanwhile, tried to process the information. Eleonora. His mother knew Clara's grandmother. "My grandmother died 3 months ago," Clara said, confirming something she already seemed to know. "She told me to look for a man named Jedediah Cooper, that he would know what to do when the time came." Mrs. Peterson nodded, a sad smile forming on her lips. "Agnes was always cautious," she commented. "She knew more than she said, and said less than she knew." Jed observed the exchange with a growing sense that he had been moving on a board whose rules he did not completely understand, as if invisible hands had been guiding each step, each seemingly fortuitous encounter. "Did you know my mother?" he finally asked, his voice harsher than he intended. Mrs. Peterson looked at him with something akin to compassion. "Everyone in this valley is connected, Jedediah," she replied, "like the roots of mesquites that intertwine under the dry earth, seeking water. Your mother understood that. Your brother Thomas, too." Something in the way she pronounced his brother's name made Jed tense. "What do you know about Thomas?" he asked, taking a step toward her. The old woman was not intimidated. Her eyes, faded blue from the years, remained steady. "I know he didn't die." "By accident," she replied with a calmness that contrasted with the gravity of her words. "And I know that those men from the city, the ones from Black River Oil, are looking for something more valuable than oil. They're looking for the water that the Coopers have protected for generations." A noise at the top of the stairs revealed that Eli had also come down and was listening to the conversation, his blue eyes, so similar to Thomas's, fixed on Mrs. Peterson. The old woman looked at him and an expression of recognition illuminated her face. "Thomas's son," she murmured, and there was a mixture of amazement and something akin to hope in her voice. "You survived." Eli didn't respond, but he approached Clara, who had begun to unwrap the package with careful fingers. Inside was a worn leather notebook and a letter sealed with red wax that showed the same symbol of the split star. Clara broke the seal with reverence and unfolded the letter. Her expression changed as she read, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. "She was your daughter," she finally said, raising her gaze toward Jed. "My mother, Lily. She was your daughter." Jed felt the air leave his lungs. Lily, a name he had tried to bury in the deepest part of his memory, along with the memories of Sarah and Michael. "Impossible," he murmured, but even as he said it, he began to see the resemblance, the same green eyes, the same shape of the nose, the way she tilted her head when she was confused or pensive. "Lily died in the fire along with Sarah and Michael." Clara shook her head, extending the letter toward him. "My grandmother saved her," she explained, her voice firm despite the emotion she clearly felt. "She took her out of the burning house and took her far away, fearing that whoever had caused the fire might try again if they knew someone had survived." Jed took the letter with trembling hands. The calligraphy was unmistakably that of Agnes, the healer who had lived on the outskirts of Dry Gulch, a woman whom many considered eccentric, but whom his mother had always treated with respect. The words danced before his eyes, fragments that stood out as if they were written in fire. "Saved Lily because Eleonora asked me to in dreams the night before. Knew the fire was not an accident. The same men who killed Thomas were looking for the secret of the water. Lily grew up strong and beautiful, so much like you, Jedediah. She fell in love, Had Clara, on her deathbed, she made me promise to bring the girl to you when the time was right. The medallion and the split star are the key. The water must be for everyone, not just for those who can pay for it. Jed raised his gaze, meeting Clara's expectant eyes. His granddaughter, Lily's daughter, the continuation of a line he believed extinct. "Did my mother talk about me?" he asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that he hadn't allowed in years. Clara nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "She said you were brave and stubborn," she replied, "that you had strong hands that could build and destroy, but an even stronger heart that knew how to love, that when I found you, I would know I had come home." Something broke inside Jed, a dam that had contained too much pain for too long. He extended his arms and Clara ran to him, burying her face in his chest while he embraced her with the strength of one who fears a newly found treasure might vanish into thin air. Eli approached uncertain, until Jed extended an arm toward him, including him in the embrace. For the first time in years, Jedediah Cooper allowed tears to flow freely down his weathered face, while he held against his chest these children who were living proof that life continued, that love could survive even the most devastating flames. Mrs. Peterson observed the scene with a serene smile, like one who witnesses the culmination of a long-elaborated plan. "The corn festival is tomorrow," she finally said, gently breaking the moment. "Black River Oil will present its final offer to buy the valley lands, including yours, Jedediah." Jed nodded, separating slightly from the children, but keeping a hand on the shoulder of each, as if fearing they might disappear if he released them completely. "We'll be there," he replied, and there was in his voice a determination that honored the man Clara had described, the man he perhaps had always been under layers of pain and isolation. "It's time for the truth to come to light, like water that springs from dry earth." Mrs. Peterson nodded, heading toward the door. "Be careful, Jedediah," she warned before leaving. "Some men value money more than life itself, and water, in times of drought, is worth more than gold." When the door closed behind her, the three remained in a silence loaded with revelations and new truths. Clara still held the leather notebook, which she now extended toward Jed. "It's my mother's diary," she explained. "I think you should read it." Jed took the notebook, feeling its weight as something precious and fragile at the same time. He opened it carefully, and the first page revealed a photograph. A young woman who was undoubtedly Lily, with baby Clara in her arms, and behind them, stuck to the page, a lock of blonde hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. "Your favorite color," murmured Clara, pointing to the ribbon. "Mom told me." Jed nodded, unable to speak as he gently passed a finger over the photograph, recognizing in Lily's face features of Sarah, of himself, and now evident also in Clara. "We should prepare for tomorrow," he finally said, closing the diary carefully. "We have much to plan." Eli, who had remained silent during the entire revelation, now spoke with a surprising determination for someone so young. "We're going to recover what is ours," he said, and for a moment Jed saw in him not only Thomas but generations of Coopers who had protected the land and the water. "What belongs to everyone?" Jed nodded, feeling for the first time in years something he had believed lost forever. Hope. A hope as clear and pure as the water they had discovered in the canyon, as the blood ties he now knew united him to these children, as the truth that finally emerged from the shadows of the past. Outside, the sun set over the dry lands of Texas, tinting the horizon red and gold, promising a new dawn. The Corn Festival had been, in better times, an event that united the entire community of Dry Gulch and its surroundings. Entire families traveled from distant ranches, set up tents, organized competitions, and the air filled with the aroma of roasted corn, children's laughter, and the music of violins and guitars that didn't cease until well into the night. This year, however, the atmosphere was different. The drought had reduced the corn harvest to a fraction of the usual, and many farmers had abandoned their lands, unable to maintain their families with fields that only produced dust and desperation. The festival, once a symbol of abundance and community, had become a pale reflection of itself, a last gathering before many decided to seek fortune elsewhere. Jed, Clara, and Eli arrived when the sun was at its zenith. They had discussed at length the strategy to follow, how to present the evidence they had gathered, and whom to approach first. Finally, they decided that the festival, with the entire community gathered, was the perfect moment to expose the truth. The main square of Dry Gulch had been decorated with faded-colored bunting and stalls where the scarce local products were sold. An improvised stage dominated the center, where a man in an impeccable suit and black hat directed what appeared to be a speech about progress and opportunities. "Black River Oil is here to help this community prosper again," he proclaimed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Our offers for your lands are generous, considering the current situation. It's an opportunity that will not present itself again." Jed observed from a distance, noting the expressions of the town's inhabitants. There was resignation on many faces, skepticism on others, and on some, especially the older ones, a silent resistance that manifested in tight lips and fixed gazes. Clara and Eli remained close to him, dressed in the best clothes they had been able to find at the ranch. Clara wore a blue dress that had belonged to Lily, hastily adjusted during the night to fit her size. Eli wore a white shirt too big for him, with rolled-up sleeves and held up with suspenders that had been Michael's. Both remained alert, observing the crowd with the caution of those who have learned to detect danger. "That's Dr. Remington," whispered Clara, discreetly pointing to a middle-aged man who was next to the stage, the one who was asking about Eli in town. Jed followed her gaze. The doctor had a distinguished appearance, with gold-rimmed glasses and perfectly combed hair. He conversed with other men in suits, though his posture denoted a certain discomfort, as if he preferred to be elsewhere. "Stay behind me," Jed murmured to Eli, who nodded without protest. They moved through the crowd, approaching Mrs. Peterson's stall, who had promised to save them a place from where they could see and hear everything without being too noticeable. The old woman received them with a tense smile and offered them lemonade, a luxury in times of scarcity that denoted the importance she gave to their presence. "They've been asking about you," she informed them in a low voice while serving the drink, "especially about the boy. They say he's the son of an important shareholder of Black River Oil, missing in an accident." Eli paled at these words, and Clara instinctively took his hand. "It's a lie," said the boy with a surprising firmness. "I remember more things now. My father, Thomas Cooper, discovered something about them, something they didn't want known." Jed nodded, feeling how the pieces fit together with increasing clarity. He brought a hand to the inside pocket of his jacket, where he kept the most important documents extracted from his mother's trunk: the original property deeds, Eli's birth certificate, the letters that documented Thomas's suspicions about Black River Oil's intentions. The speech on the stage continued, increasingly impassioned as the man in the black suit spoke of a prosperous future thanks to the company's investment. He mentioned oil wells, well-paid jobs, modern infrastructure, but he didn't mention the water or the hidden spring in the canyon. The sun rose over Dry Gulch with a different light that morning. A month had passed since the corn festival and the revelation of the aquifer. The landscape began to transform, not only due to the renewed activity that bustled in the town, but because of a subtle change in the air, a promise that seemed to whisper among the worn buildings and dusty streets. Jed observed from the hill that dominated the valley, sitting on a flat rock that still retained the heat of the previous day. From there he could see the first results of the collective work: the pipes that connected the spring in the canyon with the communal reservoirs, the rudimentary but effective channels that would carry water to the nearest fields, the reopened and deepened wells, according to the indications of the real Dr. Remington. "It's like being born again," murmured Clara, seated beside him. The girl, no, Jed, mentally corrected himself. The young woman had flourished during these weeks, as if she had found her own inner spring, a source of strength and purpose that illuminated her face with a new confidence. Jed nodded, allowing himself to enjoy the warmth he felt in his chest each time he looked at his granddaughter. The word still seemed strange to him, a linguistic treasure he savored in silence. "The land always finds a way to be reborn," he replied, extending his gaze toward the horizon, where the Cooper Ranch stood out against the morning sky. "It just needs an opportunity, and hands willing to work with it, not against it." The ranch had also changed. It was no longer the solitary refuge of a man tormented by the past, but the center of a reborn community. The long-postponed repairs had been completed with the help of grateful neighbors. The barn was again full of fresh hay. The corral housed not only Dusty, but several horses and a pair of mules that old Peterson had insisted on, giving as thanks for giving his grandchildren a future. In the lowlands by the creek, which now ran again with clear water from the spring, Eli supervised the construction of an irrigation system designed by himself with the help of Dr. Remington. The boy had revealed a natural talent for engineering and hydraulics, as if the knowledge had been dormant in his blood, waiting for the right moment to awaken. "Do you think they'll stay?" asked Clara, interrupting Jed's thoughts. "The people from town, I mean. Now that there's water, they could rebuild what they had." The question contained another unformulated one, a concern that Jed had detected in her eyes during the last few days. The fear that, once the water supply was secured for Dry Gulch, they would no longer be necessary, that the newly discovered bond could dissolve like morning mist under the sun. "Some will leave," he replied honestly. "Others will return, and many will stay, because they have rediscovered something they thought lost, the connection with the land, the value of working together for something greater than oneself." Clara nodded, her green eyes fixed on a distant point, as if trying to visualize that uncertain but possibility-filled future. "And us?" she finally asked, with that direct frankness that characterized her. "What will we do, grandfather?" The word left her lips naturally, without preparation or ceremony, as if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment. Jed felt something stir within him, an emotion so intense that for a moment it prevented him from breathing. "We," he replied when he finally recovered his voice, "will do what the Coopers have always done, take care of the land and the water and those who depend on them." They remained silent for a moment, letting the implicit promise in those words settle between them like a pact sealed without the need for signatures or oaths. In the distance, they saw Eli coming up the path toward them. He carried something in his hands, an object he treated with extreme care, as if fearing it might break with the mere touch of the air. "I finished it," he announced, when he reached their height, his face illuminated by a smile of satisfaction. In his hands, he held a small sculpture carved in mesquite wood, the hardest and most resistant wood of the desert. It represented 3 united figures: a tall man, a girl with her hair gathered in a braid, and a boy who held what appeared to be a medallion. The 3 figures formed a protective circle around a stylized representation of the split star, from whose center emerged a thread of polished silver that simulated flowing water. "It's beautiful, Eli," murmured Clara, delicately touching the figure that represented her. Jed said nothing, but his moist eyes spoke with more eloquence than any word. He extended his hand and touched the boy's head, a gesture that had become his particular way of expressing affection and pride. "It's for the new fountain in the square," explained Eli, pointing toward the town where a stone structure was being built that would house the main distribution point of the spring water. "The mayor said we needed something to remind everyone of the story of how the water was found." Jed nodded, understanding the profound symbolism of that gift. It wasn't vanity that had motivated Eli to create that sculpture, but the desire to preserve not only the memory of what had happened, but the lesson it contained, the importance of protecting what sustains life, of sharing it instead of hoarding it. "Thomas would be proud," he said simply, and saw how Eli's eyes shone upon hearing his father's name. "And your mother too, Clara." The 3 remained a moment longer on the hill, observing the landscape that stretched before them. The desert was still there with its austere beauty and its dangers. The drought had not completely ended, and it would take years to restore the natural balance of the region. But now there was hope, a tangible hope, that flowed like the newly discovered water, connecting the past with the future through a present full of possibilities. When they finally descended toward the ranch, they did so together, like the family they had become through pain, loss, and rediscovery. A family forged not only by blood, but by the conscious choice to remain united, to heal together, to build something new on the foundations of the past. The Cooper Ranch, once a symbol of isolation and pain, now rose as a beacon of renewal and promise, its windows shining under the morning sun like eyes that had finally learned to look toward the future without fear. Autumn came to the lands of Texas, bringing with it a subtle change in the air, a promise of more clement temperatures after the relentless summer. The first rains in years had fallen during the last week of September, not the violent and ephemeral storms that ravaged the dry earth without penetrating it, but soft and persistent rains that infiltrated the grateful soil, awakening seeds dormant for too long. In the new central square of Dry Gulch, renamed Spring Plaza, The fountain created with Eli's sculpture occupied the place of honor. Water sprung from the center of the split star and fell into a circular pond where children used to throw copper coins, making wishes that no longer had to do with survival, but with dreams they dared to flourish again. Jed walked slowly around the square, observing the changes that 3 months had brought to the town. Businesses that had closed reopened their doors. Families that had left returned, bringing with them new ideas and renewed energies. The school, closed during the worst years of the drought, had restarted its classes with Clara as the teacher's assistant, a role that the young woman performed with a surprising maturity for her years. He stopped in front of a newly constructed building that housed the office of the Water Council, an organization created by the inhabitants of the valley to fairly and sustainably manage the newly discovered resource. Eli spent several hours there each week, working with Dr. Remington on detailed maps of the aquifer and plans for its responsible use. Through the window, Jed could see his grandnephew, a family relationship he still found difficult to define precisely, bent over a drawing table, his face concentrated as he traced what appeared to be distribution channels. Beside him, Jonathan Remington pointed out details on the map, explaining concepts that Jed barely understood, but that Eli absorbed with the eagerness of a thirsty land receiving the first drops of rain. He smiled to himself, recognizing in that boy not only physical but spiritual traits of generations of Coopers, the determination of his brother Thomas, the patience of his mother Eleonora, the intellectual curiosity that Jed himself had abandoned after the tragedy, but now rediscovered through these children that destiny had placed in his path. He continued his walk until he reached the town cemetery, a quiet place where ancient cypresses cast elongated shadows over limestone tombstones. He stopped in front of 3 newly arranged graves, those of Sarah and Michael Cooper, and a symbolic one for Lily, whose body rested in a distant place but whose spirit, Jed was sure, had finally found its way back home through Clara. From his pocket, he extracted 3 small, polished stones collected from the bed of the reborn creek. He placed them on each tombstone, a gesture his mother had taught him as a way of saying, "I remember you, you remain part of my path." "They would have liked to see what this place has become," said a voice behind him. Jed turned to find Mrs. Peterson, who held a bouquet of wildflowers that were beginning to reappear in the surrounding fields. Her face, furrowed by wrinkles that told stories of sun and wind, showed a serenity that reflected Jed's own. "Sometimes I think they do see it," he replied, surprising himself with that confession that revealed a spirituality he thought he had lost along with his family. In each plant that blooms, in each child who laughs while playing in the fountain, in each new project that arises in the town. The old woman nodded, placing some flowers on each grave with the solemnity of an ancient ritual. "Water always finds its way," she said, unknowingly repeating the words of Eleonora Cooper. "And so does love, Jedediah. Love also always finds its way, even if it has to flow underground for years, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Jed felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot that finally untied after years of tension. Tears he had contained for too long flowed freely down his cheeks, not of pain, but of acceptance, of reconciliation with a past that was no longer a burden but a foundation on which to build. That night, on the porch of the Cooper Ranch, 3 generations of the family gathered under a starry sky that seemed closer and more welcoming than in previous years. Clara read aloud a book recovered from Eleonora's trunk, ancient stories about the first settlers and their relationship with the land. Eli listened attentively while carving a new sculpture, his fingers moving with the precision of one who has found his vocation. Jed, seated in his rocking chair, observed these young people who had brought life to his withered existence, who had planted seeds of hope where only dry roots of bitterness remained. The medallion of the split star now rested in the center of the dining room table, not as a secret to protect, but as a visible reminder of the legacy they shared. Life wasn't perfect. The trials against those responsible at Black River Oil continued, with painful testimonies that reopened barely healed wounds. The drought, though mitigated by the discovery of the aquifer, remained a reality in many areas. Rebuilding what had been lost would take years, perhaps generations. But now there was a purpose, a sense of belonging and continuity that transcended individual losses. The Cooper Ranch was again what its founders had imagined, not just a place to live and work, but a point of connection between the past and the future, between the land and those who inhabited it, between the water hidden in the depths and the life that flourished on the surface. When Clara finished reading, a comfortable silence settled among them, the kind of silence that is only possible between people who have learned to communicate beyond words, who understand that some feelings are too deep to be expressed with sounds. It was Eli who finally broke the silence, raising his gaze from his work to contemplate the horizon where the first stars began to shine with renewed intensity. "Sometimes, when everything is very still," he said, with that mixture of innocence and ancient wisdom that characterized him, "I can hear the whisper of water under the earth, as if it were singing a very ancient song, a song that tells the story of all who have passed through here before us." Clara nodded, perfectly understanding what her cousin was trying to express. "I hear it when I'm at school teaching the younger children," she confessed. "It's not exactly a sound, it's more like a presence, something that flows between us, connecting us." Jed said nothing, but his silence was eloquent. He too had felt it, that barely perceptible murmur that came from no external source, but from the rediscovered connection with something greater than himself, something that flowed like water, that nourished like rain, that remained constant under the changing surface of daily life. That night, while the house slept, and only the occasional hooting of an owl broke the silence of the desert, Jed Cooper remained awake in his room, contemplating through the open window the night sky that seemed to contain all the answers to questions he didn't even know he had. He was no longer the broken and bitter man who had opened the caucho to a soaked girl in the midst of a storm. The cracks were still there, scars that time had softened but never completely erased. But now, those same cracks allowed light to enter, water to flow, life to find its way. Like the dry earth that finally receives the longed-for rain, Jedediah Cooper had learned to absorb pain, to integrate it into his being, and to transform it into something that nourished instead of destroyed. He had learned, in short, the language of water, the ability to adapt, to flow around obstacles, to find new paths when the old ones became blocked, to reflect light even in the darkest moments. And in that learning, in that silent but profound transformation, he had finally found what the desert of his soul had yearned for so long, not the forgetting of what was lost, but the ability to honor it through a life fully lived, with purpose and connection. Outside, a gentle breeze swayed the branches of the mesquites, creating a whisper that seemed to respond to Jed's unformulated thought. The whisper of a land that was no longer dry, of a heart that had relearned the rhythm of hope, of a future that unfolded before him like a river that finally finds its way to the sea.